Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today I'm going to be telling you about possibly the fastest way to grow your property portfolio. You can use this strategy to grow your portfolio exponentially in your property investing journey. This strategy will work anywhere in the country, or technically anywhere all over the world, but it will work better in certain parts of the country, like London and the South East, than it will work in other parts of the country, like up north. But before we get started, only about 6% of you are actually subscribed to the channel, which is really low. So subscribe, it's free and you can always unsubscribe later. Now let's get into the video. Now, to grow a property portfolio, you're always going to have to start somewhere, with your first property. And unfortunately it is going to cost you some money and it's not going to be given to you for free. Probably about £10,000 to £15,000 and maybe an interest-free credit card, as that can help you out with the refurbishments if you don't have the money to hand. But obviously make sure that you do have a plan to pay off that credit card at some point, rather than just letting the debt mount up. Now there are some strategies that you could use that require much less starting cash, like lease options, rent to rent and deal sourcing. You'll probably only need a few £1,000s to get started. But I don't really like these strategies and I don't really recommend them because the chance of success with these strategies is just so low. I do think the strategies work, but just not very often, and that's why I don't really talk about them on my channel. It's probably best to get started by buying your own personal home. That way you can use a 10% deposit and get a good interest rate, rather than having to save up a 25% deposit and jump straight into either bridging finance or buy-to-let finance, which carries a much higher interest rate. Once you've brought your own home and you've bought something that's a little bit tatty, needs some fixing up and some TLC, you can then live in the property while you refurbish it. It can be like an after-work project or a project to do with the other half. It's probably best to do things like the painting and replacing the skirting boards and maybe the flooring yourself. You could even try your hand at some plastering, but things that you probably need qualifications for, like replacing windows or replacing the electrics, is probably best to leave to the professionals. It's probably best to buy something that needs some fixing up and needs some love, because you can really force up the equity in these properties. Say if you live in the southeast of the UK and you found a road and all of the houses on that road were the exact same size, the exact same footprint and had the exact same room layout. Let's assume that in the past 12 months there have been 4 homes sold on this road for about £300,000. Maybe one sold for £298,000, maybe one sold for £303,000 and the other 2 sold for exactly £300,000. Therefore it would be fair to assume that all of the other houses on this road are also worth about £300,000 because they're the exact same size and everything else. But let's assume that there's one home on this road that doesn't really look quite as nice. Maybe it's got the green bathtub, the pink carpet and the old wooden kitchen from the 80s. You can probably pick this home up for about £240,000. And that's step 1. Buy your first home. Obviously if you buy this £240,000 home that's the exact same size as all of the other ones, with a 10% deposit, the deposit alone is going to be £24,000, which is obviously more than I mentioned earlier when I said £10,000 or £15,000. But for your very first home, you might not be buying a 240k home. You could probably pick something up for £100,000, maybe £150,000 using your 10% deposit, which is about £10,000 to £15,000. But I'm just trying to use really simple numbers here for my example. Anyway, I was talking about how you can really force up the equity in this home because you can buy the home for £240,000, but it'll only cost you about £15,000 to £20,000 to do a complete home refurbishment. Therefore you've generated about £40,000 in equity, minus some legal fees, loan setup costs and all bits and pieces like that, by just doing some painting, replacing the flooring, maybe the bathroom and the kitchen, and bits and pieces like that, which isn't too bad for a few months' work. Once you've lived in the property for a while and enjoyed your time, you might want to change your circumstance and remortgage the property from a residential mortgage onto a buy-to-let mortgage and live somewhere else, or rent somewhere, or buy somewhere new. And this is step 2, to refinance from your residential mortgage on your buy-to-let mortgage. Now because we've generated all this additional equity, we don't even have to put in any more money, even though we're moving from a 10% deposit mortgage to technically a 25% deposit buy-to-let mortgage. Let me quickly show you the numbers for that. So you've bought the property for 240k using a 10% deposit mortgage, so 24k, and therefore the mortgage on that property is 216k. Now you've put in that work and the home is now probably worth about 300k, as it looks the same as all of the other homes on that road. But the loan is still 216k because you didn't take out any more money for those refurbishments, and therefore your equity in this property is now 84k. Now, if you want to refinance that property onto a 75% buy-to-let loan, you'll probably need about 75k of equity, which we had. And therefore, obviously a 75% buy-to-let loan will be a 225k loan. And they'll give you this loan, providing you meet the affordability criteria, because that loan will successfully pay off the old loan that you had on the property. You'll also get a little bit of cash back out the other end, probably around 9,000, less obviously your legal fees and your loan setup fees. Now again, I've ignored those legal fees and those loan setup fees just to make the numbers really easy. But those are definitely some expenses that you will incur. So let's just assume that you don't get that additional 9k back into your bank account, it just goes on the legal fees and the setup fees. Let's assume that we've saved up some money and we're going to buy a new home and then rent out this current one, which is perfectly okay to do. What you can't do is obviously buy a home with a residential mortgage and then rent it out straight away. Or buy a home with a residential mortgage if your sole intention is to sell the property really fast and never live in the property. Obviously, if you buy a property with a residential mortgage, you have to live in it. Then obviously your circumstances can change and you can convert the loan from a residential mortgage to a buy-to-let mortgage and rent the property out. So you've got that additional money saved up and you're going to do pretty much the exact same thing again. Buy a property that needs refurbishing, live in the property, refurbish it, enjoy your time, and then eventually you can convert the property onto a buy-to-let loan and just effectively follow that same blueprint. This strategy starts off quite slowly, but then snowballs and compounds and gets faster and faster towards the end. Now you will also be earning rental income from the first property, so it won't take you quite as long to save up that money for the second property and maybe the third property. But for this example, I want to ignore any rental income that you do get and focus solely on the power of equity and how you can use equity in your home to fund future purchases. Let's assume that you do property number 2 and that takes you a few years, and then you move on to property number 3 and that takes you a few more years again. Great, we've now got 3 properties, but that first property that you bought, say 5 or 6 years ago, isn't still going to be worth £300,000. Also, just a quick one, if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to drop a like down below as this really helps out my channel. Now this is a very extreme example, but let's assume that you bought that first property in London and you bought that property in 2002. The time is now 2008 and this property right here increased in value from 2002 to 2008 from £275,000 to £675,000. This means that that home that you bought for £240,000 increased its value to £300,000, in 5 or 6 years time could be worth £700,000. Now obviously this is a very extreme example, and even if you did buy that home in London, it's probably not going to be worth £700,000. Although it is quite fair to assume that in 5 years the value of your property could increase by between 5 and 15%, maybe more if you live in London or the southeast. Let's just assume that your returns weren't quite this crazy and your £300,000 home increased by about 15% and is now worth about £350,000. Now, if you then refinance that property again and refinance that 350k-ish property onto a 75% buy-to-let loan, that 262k loan will pay off your 225k loan from earlier and you'll be left with about 40k-ish. And that 40k will go to fund the purchase of property number 4 and almost fund the purchase of property number 5, and you haven't even needed to do any additional saving. And that's step number 3. Refinance your property again and pay off the earlier loan and use that additional money to fund your future purchases. Now this is where the strategy starts to snowball, because you haven't spent any time at all saving and you almost have enough money for another 2 properties. Now you're not exactly going to get exactly 40k out the other end. There's also going to be money that goes towards legal fees, loan setup fees, and maybe early repayment charges. So let's just assume that you only get 24k out the other end to fund the purchase of 1 additional property. Let's now assume that you buy property number 4, live in it, refurbish it, enjoy your time, and then save up some money for a few years, and then move on to property number 5 and rent out property number 4, doing the same thing with property number 5, living in it, refurbishing it, enjoying your time, and then moving on and converting that into a rental property as well. And now you've got 5 properties, and it's been another say 5 or 6 years, but actually all 3 of your older properties have now increased in value by say 5 to 15%. So now this time when you refinance not just 1 property but 3 properties, you're not only going to be able to take out 40k from your refinancing, but doing that 3 separate times. So you have 120k to fund some future purchases. And this is step number 4, rinse and repeat that refinancing structure. And this is where the strategy really starts getting into the snowball, because you've now got 120k to fund some future purchases, and that might go towards another 3 purchases. And then in 5 or 6 years time, instead of having 3 properties to refinance again, you now have the 5 properties refinanceable and your extra 3 that you've purchased on top. So not only do you get 40k out once or even 3 times, but now you get it out 5 times. And now that snowball just keeps rolling and rolling. You don't even have to bother saving between each property or even factoring in that rental income, because the portfolio will just grow in equity as the property market appreciates, and you can just refinance it and pull out that equity to buy more properties. Now I do want to throw in some caveats here. Obviously I've ignored legal fees, stamp duty, loan setup fees, early repayment charges, and these are all expenses that you are probably going to incur, unless obviously you find a mortgage that doesn't have early repayment charges, for example. Therefore this strategy isn't quite as easy as it looks on paper, and it might take you a few more years, and you might have to factor in that rental income, and you might have to save some more money between properties because you are going to have some additional expenditure. You also don't want to be doing every single refurbishment on 0% credit cards. It's fine for the first project, but you don't want to have loads and loads of 0% credit cards that are all completely maxed out and you have no way to pay off these balances. You need to make sure that you pay off those credit cards or just save up additional money for those refurbishments. Although you will be getting rental income and therefore rental profits, so you might not have to save up quite as much between each property, and you might be able to do this strategy a little bit quicker. But obviously for my calculations, I just ignored the rental income. It's also worth noting that while using equity can be a great way to fund future purchases, it's also not a good idea to keep your entire portfolio constantly mortgaged up to 75% or even 80% if you can get those buy-to-let mortgages. That's a surefire way to wipe out your entire portfolio in a recession. A much better idea is obviously to focus on paying down those mortgages to lower leverage rates like 50%, rather than topping them up to 75% or 80% every 2 or 3 years. Also, while properties do go up in value, it's never guaranteed. A property over the space of 5 years might increase by 5% or 15% or 200%, or it might fall by 40%. It's never guaranteed that you're going to get an X% increase or an X% decrease. Also, if you think that your property might be worth £300,000, it doesn't guarantee that the bank will think the same. They might think it's worth less and therefore might not let you refinance or might not let you refinance for the money that you want. Obviously this strategy does also work better in areas that experience high property value growth, like London and the South East, and potentially won't work quite as well up in the North, although it would still work as the North has increased in values over the past say 5 or 10 years. But some areas haven't recovered from the 2008 recession, so again that's never guaranteed either. In summary, I wanted to show you that how using equity in a property or a portfolio is a great way to fund future purchases. Step 1 is to buy a property. Step 2 was to at some point refinance it onto a buy-to-let mortgage. Step 3, as at some point down the line, to refinance it again and draw out the equity. And step 4 was to rinse and repeat. And as always guys, if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out some of my others. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell, because that way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers!